Good morning, or good day, good evening, and so on to those who may be in a different time zone. My name is Waltraud Meyerhofer. I'm a professor of German and Global Health Studies at the University of Iowa. Welcome to the webinar Exploring Anne Frank and Difficult Life Stories. This is also the book that we co-edited with Dr. Kirsten Kumpf-Barley and Dr. Doyle Stevick. In it, 15 scholars, educators, and writers share their engagement with the story of Anne Frank and her diary and other studies around empathy, education, and human rights. Thank you for joining me and my colleague, Dr. Kirsten Kumpf-Barley, for this webinar. For me, Anne Frank and her diary are a portal to issues involving remembrance of the crimes of the Nazi regime and coming to terms with the past, with issues of persecution and human rights in general today, but mostly in literature, also to resilience and hope in some, what we call in our book, difficult life stories. I will briefly introduce the speakers of this seminar. Each of them will take around 12 minutes to speak. Then there should be enough time to hear comments and questions from the audience and answer questions. Our first speaker is Amal Kassir. Amal Kassir is a Syrian-American poet, writing teacher, speaker, and entrepreneur. She has performed and taught in 13 countries and cities all over the world. She pioneered a youth Muslim mental wellness program, that's quite a title, in Denver, Colorado, and currently runs House of Amal, a global writing community. Ms. Kassir, you have contributed a poem to the book, the poem you wrote for the planting of the Anne Frank sapling in Iowa City in 2022. It is titled Planting a Tree Today, or Arborists for the Human Spirits. You are also a spoken word performer. Would you be so kind as to perform the poem for us in your own unique way?
What a pleasure it is. Thank you for the introduction. And what a time to be alive right now. And what a time to be in the mirror image of a beautiful young girl named Anne Frank. I wrote this poem in a very specific space and time, as was mentioned, when we planted the tree at the University of Iowa. And as a poet, I always say that sometimes the poetry just writes itself. And truly, that was one of the occasions. I'll begin. Here's a copy of the book. And I hope that all together with a hand on our heart, we can take a deep breath before we dive into the story of the human spirit. Bismillah. If the end of the world would be imminent, I would still plant a tree today. Otto Frank. If the final hour comes while you have a seed in your hands and it is in your power to plant it, you should plant it. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Shalom. Salamu alaikum. Peace be upon all of you. What a mighty gathering. My name is Amal, and my name means hope in Arabic. My father is from Syria, and my mother is a German American, and I was born by the mountains in Denver, Colorado. I am a Muslim woman, and when I gave this speech, it was the second to last day of Ramadan, honoring a Jewish girl. commemorating a vision of peace standing in the place where my mother was born, in the UNESCO City of Literature, planting a tree with an interfaith, interracial, inter-everything community. Paul Ingle, the founder of the Iowa Writers Workshop, said, "If you are reading poetry to each other, you are not fighting each other. And if this is not poetry, I don't know what is." I come to you today to tell you what I believe is the solution to keeping this tree alive, for realizing its vision inside our hearts, considering the climate that we are in. My hope for today is that we all walk away no better than how we arrived, holding in us the solution that will make the world around us more peaceful, more kind, and more merciful. My message today is inspired by the girl that we are here to honor, Anne Frank, a young Jewish girl in Nazi Europe who made a choice that she was going to tell her story, even though there was a brutal war outside her window. There was also a tree outside her window, and she chose to tell us about both. She chose not to let the war consume her. She did not let it take away her voice or her humanity. And I think, given that I am a writer and she is a writer, and that we are in the city of writers, we must acknowledge the incredible power of the written word. It is the writer that chooses what the story is going to be. And Anne Frank chose a story of family, of growing up, of forgiving, of doing what's right, of choosing to believe despite all the reasons not to. And there are plenty of reasons not to. Today's message is one of hope, of courage, and of humanity. So that this tree is not just a portrait of possibility, but it is a mirror that we get to see ourselves in. The truth is, as I'm sure you all know, we have not yet arrived to the vision of Anne Frank. This tree is planted in a difficult, difficult world, a world that still suffers from the pollution of the human heart. Xenophobia, supremacy, oppression, bomb dropping, chosen ignorant, campaigns of hate, and if not hate, closed eyes, closed ears, closed doors, and so much forgetfulness. The symbolic tree stands outside as a beacon of light, calling unto us, firstly, to never forget what happened, and secondly, to never stop growing, and to make sure that we don't forget anything. The driving force behind the hatred that fueled the Holocaust was a choice to exclude people from the definition of humanity. What Nazi Germany did was a radical dehumanization of a people who were but human. And if the diary of Anne Frank taught me anything, it is indeed how human we actually are. That truly, even when we are in a state of war and execution, people are still people. Puberty striking and family scuffles, feeling misunderstood, having hopes and dreams, preferences and delights, having something to look forward to. People are people. In the words of the albino hip-hop artist Brother Ali, he says, "Can you tell me what language you laugh in? The human reaction is smiles and cries. What language are the tears when they're falling from your eyes?" A couple days ago, a couple years ago at this point, the news delivered a most ironic headline. Germany, one of the most generous of the European nations today to the refugees, started evicting Afghan refugees to accommodate people fleeing Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to get here and say foreign policy is that simple. This is tricky and sticky, and we have a duty to help our people. And here we are, facing a modern-day tragedy in Europe, a violent war that resembles so closely what we saw in World War II. Death tolls high, devastation requiring mass migration. Nations opening their doors, corporations calling on people to donate and support and stand in solidarity. This war brought out a light in the hearts of modern mankind, and our capacity to mobilize is evident in the outpouring support. But with these generous entities, suddenly, publicly, pick and evict blatantly, deciding who is worth more humanity, what kinds of messaging does this send? I believe that a nation and a heart are defined by the same thing: who they let in. It is well known that the Frank family tried to come to the United States, but at the time, because of the policies in place, there was no place for them. Policies of open doors and closed hearts, and where the camera points, it is telling of the state of humankind both then and now. You see, I have spent much time inside of the human heart. It has served as a bunker during some dark moments. But I have learned, even inside the most beautiful hearts, there is room for expansion, room for healing. But we must excavate. We must look within. And what's happening with world leaders and the way they are treating some refugees over others, this selective compassion is having an impact on the human psyche, on our entire collective consciousness. I believe firmly, now more than ever, when it comes to humanity, there is no us and them. There is only us. And to attempt to fracture this will result in selective compassion and eventually, always, more war. When we close the door on people, we are telling them that a closed door is what they deserve. When we turn our backs, we are telling them backs are all that they are worth. When we don't listen, we are telling them that they don't deserve to be heard. When we don't look, we are telling them that they don't deserve to be seen. When we keep people out of our hearts, we are telling them that they don't belong in the heart of humanity. This is not an environment where a tree can grow. This is not an environment where the world can heal. To feel unheard, unseen, and like you don't belong in the human heart, this is the greatest pain that I think humanity has ever known. Not everyone is an Anne Frank who can write themselves into their power. Just imagine if she believed what the Nazis were telling her about herself. We would have never heard her story. My family lost 49 members to the war in Syria. And the first to die was my 13-year-old cousin, who was sniped in the head while eating breakfast with her family at their farm. This was the age of Anne Frank when she started her diary. There have been times in this world when the only hope I had was my own name. And when I saw a world that was telling me to give up and accept the state of the world through numbness. And as a poet, I had to find a solution. I needed to know how. How could people do this to each other? How could those Nazis have pressed the buttons to those gas chambers? How could those police stand on the necks of those Black men? How could those soldiers go into homes and rip families out of their beds? How could people slaughter with dull knives? How? How could they cut down trees? And to answer this question, a mighty question, I had to understand humanity. I had to understand myself. I had to look upstream and realize that the problem starts with closing doors and keeping people out of the human heart. When it comes to humanity, there is no us and them. There is only us. In April 2003, a remarkable project of human endeavor was completed. Thousands of scientists, billions of dollars to map every single gene that goes into the human being. This was the Human Genome Project. And the visionaries behind it described it as reading our own instruction book. The outcome being that we cross a bridge that we will never go back across in the future, from ignorance to knowledge. I believe that there is a spirit that gathered all of us here today in this webinar and planting that tree for Anne Frank. I believe that we have all been invited here to do something similar to what the scientists of the Human Genome Project did. We are called today to delve inwards, to scuba dive into our own hearts, remake the map of the human spirit for all that it is, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that we may find the infections, the pain, and the resilience, so that we may find all that is inside of us that can close doors, and then we open them, both in nations and in hearts. Will we cultivate this tree inside our own chests? Make it so that instead of overlooking the tree in hiding, we can instead let Anne Frank sit under it? We will invite the children of Afghanistan, the girl from Guatemala, the boy from Flint, the family from Gaza to sit next to her in our hearts, in our nations, under this tree. Anne Frank said, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of a confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder which will destroy us too. I can feel the sufferings of millions, and yet, if I look up to the heavens, I think that it will all come right, that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. Will you join me today as arborists of the human spirit in all its glory and all its ugliness, so that we can heal and nourish the heart of mankind, so that we can invite peace and tranquility to return again, or perhaps for the very first time? Anne said it herself. How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. Let's choose to create the world that we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. How powerful. Oh, I need a pause here. For the next few speakers, my questions were the same or similar for each of them. The first question was, tell us what brought you to Anne Frank or Holocaust education? What was it that motivated you to include Anne Frank, her diary, and other difficult life stories in your research, teaching, or creative writing? Then panelists may either speak about the chapter they contributed to the book, Exploring Anne Frank and Difficult Life Stories, or tell us more about where their journey has taken them since, and what they would like our participants out there to know. Our first speaker is Dr. Oren Baruch Stier. He contributed a chapter on the virtual Anne Frank. Dr. Stier is a professor of religious studies and the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Florida International University. His research addresses Jewish and Holocaust testimony, memory, education, and materials culture. He regularly leads single and multi-day workshops to educators on teaching Anne Frank and the Holocaust. Dr. Stier.
Thank you so much. It is an incredible challenge to follow Amal. Thank you for your poem and your words. I not only don't have a poem to read, I don't actually have anything to read. I didn't prepare a formal presentation, but I wanted to just say a few words about my what sort of brought me to this work. And I think the best way I like to explain it, my first book was about institutionalized Holocaust memory, about the institutions that create a culture of Holocaust remembrance, whether they be museum institutions, the institution of the March of the Living, institutions that are dedicated to video archiving projects, and so on. And after that book, I realized that for institutions to create the culture of Holocaust memorialization, they need a series of building blocks. And I started wondering, well, what are the building blocks of Holocaust memory? And I developed the concept of the Holocaust icon, which was my second monograph, which came out about 10 years ago. And the Holocaust icon is sort of a conceptual framework that allows us to talk about the things that I think we intuit are the most recognizable symbols of the Holocaust, the things that the currency that people use when referring to the Holocaust and when trying to filter the Holocaust into their own understanding, which is, of course, what memory does in general. And so I explored the concept of the icon, and I looked at different types of icons. So, for example, the Holocaust-era railway car is a material icon. The phrase Arbeit macht frei is a linguistic icon. And when I got to the concept, there's the number 6 million is a numerical icon. And when I started thinking about what is a person who is the most iconic representation of the Shoah, I felt like it was natural to land on Anne Frank. And what I was really interested in in that book, Holocaust Icons, was in trying to understand how is this icon created, sort of look behind the scenes, peel back the veil at the way that the iconic Anne Frank comes to be, right? Comes to be the person that so many people all around the world consider to be a friend, consider to be someone, a real person they can talk to. And where does this come from? I realize that there are two components to this in general. One is the literary component, and the other is the visual component. And so I explored both of those in my book 10 years ago, the literary Anne Frank and the development of that iconic view, which leads to the famous passages from the diary that are often repeated, including in what Amal just read, and then the visual icon, the visual Anne Frank relates to the images we have of her. So following that, I didn't stop thinking about Anne Frank. And one of the things I thought about even more after the book came out was the irony of certain kinds of representations. Just one little example, the photographic record does not intersect with, the visual record does not intersect with the literary record at all, right? The photos stop before the Frank family went into hiding. And the diary, except for a couple of entries, right, around her birthday, really, the diary really only picks up until after they're already in hiding. So there are two discrete representational structures. And I started wondering about what are the other aspects of Anne Frank that are kind of that are not so obvious and that need to be sort of uncovered in order for us to be more intelligent consumers of the iconic Anne Frank. And that, I think, led me to thinking about using some of my research to turn it around to develop it into a teaching context, and particularly to use it in teacher training workshops to help teachers who deal with the Holocaust and other difficult histories, and who very, very often, as we well know, use the Diary of Anne Frank, to help them think through what are some ways they can defamiliarize that iconic vision of Anne Frank, and by getting underneath it, by getting behind it, and by learning more about both the visual Anne Frank and the literary Anne Frank, that they could really get a much fuller understanding of who she was, and in many ways who she continues to be. So in my teaching workshops, for example, we spend a lot of time looking, for example, at family photos of the Frank family before the time in hiding. We also spend a lot of time looking at representations, for example, of the ending, right? The ending of the Anne Frank story. How has that been represented, and how can that be turned around into a teaching context to be something constructive within the classroom for thinking about student writing, student thinking about difficult histories. So the chapter in the book called The Virtual Anne Frank kind of picks up on some of these issues related to the framework of virtuality, because there are aspects of Anne Frank that are virtual, not, and that doesn't just include, let's say, the internet presence, although that's exactly how I started. One of the things I discovered when I was doing my research was the Anne Frank Facebook page, which at the time I think had about 2.5 million followers or something, and I thought, that's kind of interesting, right? That's kind of strange. A dead person has a Facebook page that is very much alive and has followers and has and is, obviously it's not managed by her, and has posts and has reactions. And so that got me thinking about what are the other ways we can think about Anne Frank as in the virtual sphere. And when you look at the definition of the word virtual, it really lends itself to, I think, to some fascinating interpretations of how we think about the conceptual framework of virtuality. So from the chapter, that led me to 4 different kind of ways we can productively think about a virtual Anne Frank. They are something that's apparently but not physically present. That would be like a digital Anne Frank. Something that's imagined with potential reality, like a surviving Anne Frank. Something that's virtuous, because the word etymologically relates to the word virtual. So something virtuous as in a saintly Anne Frank. And finally, something that's nearly or almost ideal, as in an exemplary Anne Frank. And so what I do in the chapter is really explore these different sort of variations of virtuality and thinking about the ongoing presence of Anne Frank in our lives, despite the fact that she's not present. right? The irony that as one source that I quoted, a rabbi whose name I forget now, who had a student come to her who asked if Anne Frank was the most famous Holocaust survivor, and she said, "Wait a second. I mean, Anne Frank didn't survive, right? But then again, in many ways, she did, right? So what is this? This surviving quality is that aspect of virtuality that is what I explored in the book chapter. In terms of other work, I mean, I've got my hands on a lot of things, but just two things that I'll mention. One is working on a edited collection of essays related to Holocaust objects in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, related to a workshop that Laura Levitt and I convened in the summer of 2023. And so that will hopefully, maybe it'll be out next year. It's an edited collection in the online journal, MAVCOR journal, Material and Visual Cultures of Religion. And another project I have ongoing, very, very long-standing, slowly evolving essays on Elie Wiesel that I hope to develop further in the future. And then my work really in Holocaust education, I collaborate with colleague Becky Christ and Brandon Haas on research related to Holocaust education, particularly in the state of Florida, trying to understand the education mandate here and in other states, and how Holocaust education standards develop over time, and how teachers use them in the classrooms to more effectively teach. So that, in a nutshell, is what I have to say. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stier, for the survey of your insights into the virtuality of Anne Frank and her ambivalent survivorship. That's really something to think about more. And you're doing such important work on Holocaust education. Well, thank you also for keeping us in our timeline. I want to welcome those who may have joined us late. You may send in comments and questions in the chat. There will be a Q&A time at the end of our webinar. We want to have all the panelists speak first. Our next one is Dr. Naomi Yavne-Close. She is currently the Reverend Bienvenue Distinguished Chair in Humanities and a Professor of Languages and Cultures at Loyola University, New Orleans. Her book project, Rereading Anne Frank, explores how understanding the nuances of Anne's story can guide us in addressing contemporary challenges of prejudice and systemic racism. She also has some good news. In July, she will become the Dean of the Honors College at the University of New Mexico. For the book she wrote on In Quarantine with Anne Frank, Moving from Empathy to Compassion in a Global Pandemic. She just spoke at the Contemporary Anti-Semitism Conference in London, also on the topic Reading Anne Frank as a Jewish Girl. Together with her students, she has curated an exhibit of primary source documents about Anne Frank and the Holocaust that will be on display at the World War II Museum for Yom HaShoah. She is happy to speak to other institutions about borrowing the exhibit, and she may mention more about it to us in what is to come now. Welcome, Dr. Close.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and for that lovely introduction. I'm going to answer all three questions, and maybe I'll have time to get to the exhibit as well. But in terms of how I got involved in this work on Anne Frank, I would say that it's not so much that Holocaust education brought me to Anne Frank, but that Anne Frank brought me to Holocaust education. Growing up as a little Jewish girl in New York, I only had 4 books with Jewish protagonists. The first 3 were the All of a Kind family books by Sidney Taylor, which talk about a family of 5 Orthodox Jewish girls growing up on the Lower East Side. Wonderful series. And the 4th book was, of course, Anne Frank, a powerful story told by a girl just like me, right? We all think she could have been me, and whose story could have been mine if my 4 Jewish grandparents had not made it to safety in the United States before World War II. So my early research was on the Italian Renaissance, but when I became an honors director at a Jesuit institution, I really began to focus on the pedagogy of empathy and community and justice. My husband and I got into Anne Frank in part because my husband donated the domain name annefrank.org to the Anne Frank House. And so when I went to go speak at the European Honors Conference, we visited and we were given a VIP tour, and I got to meet with the education folks, probably some of whom you know. And so this began a collaboration that's been going on for, I think, almost 10 years now, and sparked a new direction in my research and teaching, exploring how to draw on the Holocaust to address contemporary issues of hate, but also to think about how we teach about the Holocaust in the context of Jewish history and experience. My chapter focused on the Frank family's failed attempt at immigration to the United States, which Amal alluded to. Although Anne writes in Dutch and describes her longing to become a Dutch citizen, she and the others in the annex were, of course, all Germans who were stripped of citizenship by the Nazis. So understanding Anne not just as a little Dutch girl, but in fact as a stateless refugee denied permission to emigrate to the United States, invites students to examine how American xenophobia and anti-Semitism undergirded the immigration process prior to World War II, and thus impeded a concerted US response to increasingly dire reports about the Jews of Europe. In my chapter, I encouraged students to look at the 1941 letter written by Otto Frank to his American friend, Nathan Strauss, requesting financial support for immigration efforts. Now, Strauss was the heir to the Macy's department store fortune. He was working in DC as a part of the Roosevelt administration. But the archival documents surrounding this letter reveal that despite his best efforts, his wife's efforts, Edith Frank's 2 brothers' efforts, and the National Refugee Office, the legal, logistical, bureaucratic roadblocks to emigration, right, products of anti-Semitism and xenophobia, ultimately became unsurmountable. And the file, including this poignant letter, was only discovered in 2006 in an archive of, right, 65,000 or so such files. So the heartbreak, right, of this lost opportunity to save the most recognized child victim of the Holocaust, in my argument, becomes the foundation for thinking about the philosophical and psychological arguments regarding the benefits and limits of empathy and the concept known as the identifiable victim effect, right? Our ability to connect with specific, clearly recognizable victims while ignoring larger numbers of statistical victims. Now, although many philosophers eschew empathy in favor of logical analysis as a catalyst for social change, I draw on Jesuit and social justice pedagogy to think about how we can scaffold critical thinking onto our initial empathy. Empathy for the identifiable victim, right, Anne, can be the entry point to education and analysis. We think we know Anne, which can invite us to think about the broader situation of Europe's refugees, the analogy with contemporary refugees, and use that reflection to lead to action. And the starting point for this change must not be logic, but rather the recognition, as I think Amal's poem made so beautifully clear, of this recognition of innate human dignity. Each refugee child could be Anne Frank. Indeed, in some ways, they all are Anne Frank, or at least as worthy of attention. Now, I still believe in the message of that, of my essay, but it was written in response to and during the COVID pandemic. And then came October 7th, a tremendous surge of anti-Semitism. And I began to look at this question in this sort of new phase of my project, reading Anne Frank as a Jewish girl. It addresses my concern that while Holocaust education, as I think many of us know, may contribute to greater tolerance for difference, a commitment towards fighting identity-based hatred in general, it does not necessarily teach students to advocate against or even recognize contemporary anti-Semitism. And the challenge is not that the students do not feel empathy, but that they fail to connect their empathy for the Jews of the Holocaust with the Jews of today. Students feel empathy for the Jews of the Holocaust, where I teach in New Orleans, in part because they see the very real parallels with the experience of Black people in the American South. And they can readily draw connections between American anti-immigrant rhetoric of the 1930s and 40s and the anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy unfolding in the United States today. But they do not see very often the connection between historic tropes of anti-Semitism and their contemporary permutations. And I think this is because if we look at a lot of the state Holocaust mandates and their learning outcomes, anti-Semitism starts and ends with the Nazis, right? Our students are not necessarily taught the millennia-long history and expression of anti-Jewish hatred before and after the Holocaust. So if the narrative of the Holocaust is an example of the same story of generic oppression repeated over and over, rather than the most heinous and genocidal version of the specific oppression of Jews that has been repeated over and over, we can't expect students to recognize that what they are hearing or even saying today about Jews is yet another transformation of the historic tropes of anti-Semitism. Mandates often fail to address the complexity and diversity of Jewish experience, both before and after the Holocaust. So when Jewish identity is constructed solely of the tragedy and victimhood of the Holocaust, it means that any other group can be, substituted for the Jews. And here I think Anne Frank represents both an egregious example of appropriation of Jewish suffering and also an opportunity for change. After October 7th, Anne Frank, one of 1.5 million Jewish children murdered in the Holocaust, was not evoked to honor the memory of murdered Jewish children. Rather, we saw Anne Frank in a keffiyeh. Now, however we may feel about the tragic deaths of Palestinian children or any other children, when we present Anne Frank in a keffiyeh, we obscure that Anne was in hiding and murdered because she was Jewish, a victim of anti-Jewish hatred. If learning about the Holocaust is to address contemporary anti-Semitism as one of the very real examples of hate that we face today, we have to teach students that whoever is sitting under the tree with Anne Frank today is not a girl in a keffiyeh. Anne Frank is Ariel Bibas. Regardless of Otto Frank's insistence, this is a universal, not a Jewish story. It is a universal story, but it is a Jewish story because Anne was a Jewish girl describing her unique experience of persecution for being a Jew. And we can see this when we look at the two versions of her diary, right? She begins her diary, but in spring of 1944, she revises her book, her diary, to tell the story of how we Jews lived. And what we can see is that as she's revising this diary in the spring of 1944, she is very much aware of the deep anti-Semitism, not just of the Nazis, but of her Dutch compatriots, many of whom blamed the Jews for their own suffering under the occupation. When we compare the two versions of the diary, we can see Anne's deliberate effort both to articulate more passionately the suffering of Amsterdam's Jews at the hands of the Nazis and simultaneously to portray Jews as just like non-Jews. Anne's original diary includes multiple passing references to Jewish practice. For example, attending synagogue before going into hiding. She's much more interested in talking about Hello, lighting Shabbat candles, observing Yom Kippur, and being forced by her mother on a day that is a Shabbat and was also in the middle of a terrifying razzia, for some reason she can't recognize. But when she revises her diary, Hanukkah, which was originally wonderful, now arrives without much fuss, eclipsed by Sinterklaas. And she cuts all those references to Jewish holidays, including completely omitting Hanukkah 1943. Meanwhile, her complaint that Mummy has thrust her prayer book into my hands is replaced with a completely new anecdote in which Mummy's prayer book becomes Edith's competitive response to Otto's reading of classic German authors. So I think she's interested in eliminating elements that highlight the family's differences from ordinary Dutch folks, in part because she doesn't want to appear too Jewish. So I think that this is a question that I'm really grappling with right now, because I think when we proclaim Anne's Frank's story simply to be universal, we sometimes forget that the Nazi concept of redemptive anti-Semitism reduced all Jews to vermin. And Holocaust pedagogy can sometimes replicate that dehumanization by fashioning a Jewish identity composed solely of generic victimization. And such a narrative prevents some of us from seeing the humanity of Jews today. I think Anne Frank's diary and her revision thereof can be one tool in exploring the longue durée of historic anti-Semitism, as well as in restoring the complexity of Jewish experience. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Close, for these important reminders about teaching Anne Frank, her diary, and the history of anti-Semitism, both successful strategies and possible pitfalls. At this point, I need to correct my previous error. It is not the chat function where our audience members may send in questions and comments, but a navigation bar labeled Q&A. I also want to say what a privilege it is for me to be part of the Anne Frank initiative at the University of Iowa, which originated in the German department, not in a Jewish studies program. And I think it's also a testament to mutual understanding. I always felt very appreciated and part of the Anne Frank initiative, even when it wasn't called that. Although I grew up in Germany, and although I don't have a German passport anymore, I'm as German as any other one, even just ask my husband. Anyway, that was a digression. Our next speaker is Mark Gatchell. In the book, he contributed a chapter titled I Feel Like Writing, Critical Context and the Legacy of Anne Frank in Education. Mr. Gatchell teaches at the College of St. Mary. He's a Fulbright Fellow and worked for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He has taught for 18 years in Nebraska public schools and wrote the book Think Higher, Feel Deeper, Holocaust Education in the Secondary Classroom. It was published in 2021. Mr. Gatchell also lives in Omaha. welcome, and the stage or screen is yours.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to begin by thanking the editors of the book that brought us all together today. It is, we have, I think those of us who work in academia have enough assigned to us, and I have enough contracts for books and things like that right now that it's really a delight to be sort of given a blank canvas, as I was, and, asked, hey, do you have thoughts on Anne Frank? Because indeed I do, having taught for 18 years and, in high schools, and then for the remaining time after that at university. So it was really nice to have the opportunity to share some of those thoughts, to have a platform to do some of that. I won't rehash a lot of what's in the text, but I wanted to share a few things today that have come about really since it was published, and some thoughts that I think hopefully are useful to all of us, regardless of whether you're in academia or teaching or something else. Although if you're a classroom practitioner, you're probably not attending a webinar at 10:52 a.m. on a Friday. So I was chatting with someone the other day, and he and I went to the same elementary school, went to the same middle school, went to the same high school, and got our bachelor's degrees at the same university. And I don't remember how Anne Frank came up, but I will never forget him saying, "Who is that?" And I genuinely thought that he was kidding at first. And he wasn't. And I cannot emphasize to you how intelligent this person is. Educated, has a bachelor's degree, got better grades than I did in college, and is extremely successful working in the environmental sector. So this wasn't some sort of, well, it almost felt like a conspiracy to me. Like I had to think back over my own education, and go, how did we get here? And what I realized was that Anne Frank came to me, but not to everyone, and came to me not in my education initially. And that surprised me, because I guess I had never really given any thought to where I learned about Anne Frank, or really even where I learned about the Holocaust. But I think that this brings up some really important points. And one of the first things I want to do is not jump to the obvious wrong conclusion that many people have jumped to, and many people have been, putting forward these, I'm going to air quote the heck out of this, studies, right? I teach qualitative research methods to doctoral candidates. You can make data say anything you want it to, as long as you're not actually trying to tell the truth. If you have an agenda, you can make your data say anything you want. And so the people who are saying, well, our schools are failing us, kids can't name concentration camps, and all this sensationalism, that's not scholarship. There are an awful lot of silly people saying silly things right now. People love dead Jews. That's the title of a book. And it's an egregiously offensive thing to say. No, they do not. Maybe a couple of them. No, they do not. And so I think we have to be really cautious in this space and with this material, because I think there is a really important lesson to take away, whether it's anecdotal, right? I mean, I would imagine that the person I was speaking to was one of only a handful who didn't know who Anne Frank was. I think that the rest of us encountered Anne Frank, but it was real. It was revelatory to me to realize that it didn't happen where I thought it had. But also, I think we have to be really reluctant to accept the narrative that our schools are failing. In part because that narrative has led to the dismantling of the Department of Education. And if you thought that our schools were imperfect, take away the money that we had for special education and for people living below the poverty line, and see if that makes things better or not. It won't. It won't. And so we have a real uphill climb. And what I wrote about in the book is education, is from a pedagogical standpoint. And some of it had to do with context, right? And I shared an anecdote about, Anne Frank in one of my own classrooms and how a student kind of tapped into that. Some of it has to do with sort of collective memory and societal memory. But I want to jump ahead to the part that is most relevant to the world that we live in today. And I am speaking, I realize that, you may have relinquished your German passport. I never had one. And so most of my research has to do with the American audience, not because it's the most important audience, but because that's where I find myself. And until I can convince my wife that we need to move to the south of France, that is where I will continue to find myself. And so I study how we teach about genocide in America. And I think that there's a lot to learn. But I also think that the last 3 months have been a real epiphany. Because what we find is that our leadership, right? And I'm not trying to skirt the issue. I'm talking about President Trump. I'm talking about the Trump administration, where previously they didn't really know how to act upon the things they wanted to do. They're quite efficacious this time around. I think they've done more damage in 3 months than they managed to do in 4 years previously. And not because they didn't want to do the damage before, it's because they just didn't know how. And we gave them 4 years to think about it and scheme, and they got pretty good at it. And so we find ourselves without a Department of Education. I'm here in Nebraska, the vice president of the Fulbright Association. We find ourselves without funding for Fulbrights. And so when we look at the Holocaust and we look at teaching about the Holocaust, and Anne Frank is a huge part of that. Of the 50 most read books in the English language in the entire world, Anne Frank is the only work of nonfiction. So Anne Frank is a huge part of that. We find ourselves in a different environment, and teachers find themselves, I think, at a loss for what it is that they are supposed to do, because they did not go into teaching so that they could avoid what was going on in the world. And so I think the biggest takeaway I have here, from when this book was published to the world that I find myself teaching in now, is that we need to invest heavily in democracy. And that certainly includes what we teach, but it has to go beyond that. And I think, for most of us in this audience, I know that a lot of the colleagues that are on this panel today, I know, we're professors. And I want to emphasize this. There is nothing more important we can do than supporting teachers. And I know Doyle in particular, who edited the book and who I believe is speaking after me here. Doyle and I spoke at a different seminar at a different university, I don't know, a month ago. And, one of the things that I said there that I would like to reiterate is that when we have ideas and write them down, we as academics, and we write them down, right? And this is a great book, and it's full of meaningful ideas and thoughts from meaningful people and intelligent people and thoughtful people, those ideas only become powerful in the hands of a teacher. The things that we do, the research that we do, the studies we conduct, the things that we say, the webinars we put on and record and blast into the stratosphere are only powerful when a teacher gets their hands on them and decides that they are going to use it in some way. Maybe it just impacts the way that they teach. Maybe they are better informed because of our efforts. I'm not sure. But they're the ones that reach the students. I have 6 students right now in my Holocaust through literature and film class, and it's a great class. A couple of them are going to go on to be nurses, and a couple of them are going to go do other things, right? And they're learning and they're taking an undergraduate course, and I love that. But when I was a classroom practitioner, I'd have as many as 250 students at a time, and some have even more than that. And so if we can provide them with ideas and resources and the support that they need to do their job under these incredibly trying circumstances, that's where we're going to have the greatest impact by far. And so as we look at the environment that we're in, and again, it wasn't even that environment when we were writing these chapters. Like, we'd seen it. Like, you know, it's not that I was unaware that fascists wanted to take over the country. It's just that I didn't know how effective and rapid they would be about it. And so to be able to, you know, speak with you today, which is genuinely a pleasure, is great. But I want to remind everybody that our highest calling in this field, and especially in talking about Anne Frank, who reaches most people through their education, is to support the teachers. My friend, who I began by mentioning, he didn't know because nobody told him. And I have a lot of thoughts about why maybe that didn't come up in our curriculum in that place and at that time. But I also believe that if we devote ourselves today to empowering teachers to do this work, despite the circumstances that they're operating in, that's where we're going to have the greatest impact. And so, having written about some of that in the book, the banning of Anne Frank's diary, the banning of the graphic novel, sometimes based on misunderstanding, sometimes based on understanding, sometimes based on anti-Semitism, sometimes based on other things. Education is, I really think, an undergraduate or even secondary education is really where our time is best spent. And it's certainly where I'm spending mine right now with my teaching and my publishing. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to be with you today. And I would welcome questions from our participants.
Thank you, Professor Gutschall, for these deep thoughts and reflections about education today and the narrative of failing schools. Also, thank you for keeping us on our timeline. So there will be time at the end for comments. I need to remind our audience, though, that we cannot go into a political debate because this is a University of Iowa sponsored event and thus partly federally funded. So there you have the conflict in another form of appearance and how we find ourselves in a bind talking about Anne Frank. Yes, our next speaker is Dr. Doyle Stavic, who of course does not need an introduction to anybody interested in Anne Frank. And yeah, actually talking about our audience, maybe some of you can also send in where you are, what you are, why you're interested in Anne Frank. As Professor Gutschall said, it's likely not teachers who attend this webinar, so it would be very curious. Professor Stevick is Executive Director at the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina. He was a Fulbright Scholar to Estonia in 2003 and again in 2013 to 14. He has co-edited 2 books on citizenship education and 3 books about Holocaust education around the world. Of course, he's also one of the co-editors of Exploring Anne Frank. And his chapter in the book is titled One Anne Frank Remembered. Please.
Thank you so much, colleagues. I appreciate the invitation to be able to co-edit this book with you. And the birth pangs of this book have produced quite a reward, because you have produced not just a wonderful volume, but you've really created community among scholars. I've gotten to know my peers here on the panel better, and I'm grateful for that, and that's advancing the work. So we really are in your debt for having brought us together. And even if teachers can't be watching this live broadcast, I know that many will see this. And particularly, Amal, that amazing poem you shared. I'm so delighted that link will exist to get to hear you read it in your voice. I found that just stunning. I'm also delighted to know, Warren, that you're working on this piece about objects. And big congratulations to my friends and colleagues, Naomi, now headed to New Mexico, and Mark, we didn't say this, associate professor. So that's quite a big deal. Very exciting all around. We've been asked to share some about how we came into working with Anne Frank, and a bit about our chapter and what we're working on today. I'd like to spend just a few minutes on each of those. In 1999, in the spring, I found a white supremacist pamphlet thrown in my driveway in Bloomington, Indiana, and it was too late when I discovered that it had been thrown there by my own student. I was, at that time, 30 years ago, working in archaeology. I spent time in Israel in order to dig up Megiddo, but it was basically a Greek and Latin program, and that was the classics. And when you think about the ancient Mediterranean, why was it that Greek and Latin were separated out from Hebrew and the history of the Jewish people? There was a kind of exclusion there that doesn't make much sense in many ways. I mean, where did the alphabet come from, right? It came from Aleph, Bet, and the Hebrew alphabet. So there was a form of exclusion there that actually attracted people who hated Jews. So where could you be safe from international people? Where could you be safe from Jewish people? Well, if you had to take a foreign language and didn't want to work with foreigners, it was to take Latin. And so my student, for reasons I didn't understand at the time, had enrolled in my Latin class, failed out of that class, and within 6 weeks decided there was nothing better he could do with his life than to try to start a race war. So he had ambushed 6 men and boys on the way to services in Chicago, July 4th weekend, 1999, went on a shooting spree, shot 11 people, and it was simply a nightmare. And I was only proximate. I wasn't so deeply affected as the communities and the families. But nevertheless, it did, for me, unsettle everything I thought I understood about education, about bigotry. And I switched fields going into education in order to understand, how do people fall for this stuff and what can we do about it? And in that process, I started to explore the history of extreme ideologies and bigotries, and looked at not only this young man who became a mass killer, but a student from my high school, a few years older than me, who within 9 months in the year 2000 did a very similar thing. And in both cases, they started by attacking Jewish communities, then murdering Black people, then murdering immigrants from Asian communities, and or people of Asian heritage. And it was the same pattern. It was the Nazi concept of Untermensch, underman, subhuman, still claiming lives 55 years after the Holocaust had ended. And that made me wonder, is this Holocaust really fully over if the ideology that motivated is still claiming people's lives. So I started a journey to try to understand what it took to overcome those things. And I realized in the process that, we had our own ideas in this country about different groups of people not being fully equal, and it led to segregation. And we overcame that legally, right, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. But as Amal pointed out, we haven't realized Anne Frank's dream yet. We haven't realized the potential of the Brown decision, even at this point. And as Gloria Ladson-Billings points out, we haven't realized the potential of Plessy versus Ferguson either, right? We never even got to equal and separate but equal. Well, I started to try to explore what would it take to produce the kind of community that would understand one another. And that journey took me to the former Soviet Union, the lands where the Holocaust was implemented, the era after the Soviet collapse, and societies trying to move from dictatorship to freedom, to democracy, to citizenship, to market economies. And in those lands that hadn't been free to tell the story of the Holocaust, to research the past, to understand what happened during the era of World War II, many people still saw the Soviets as the bad guys. And since Hitler wanted to manipulate, especially in the Baltic states, people there against the Soviets, he presented himself as a liberator. And that's how many people perceived that history, even until the 1990s. Well, it's very difficult to challenge anti-Semitism in a context like that. And that's where I came into touch with the Anne Frank House. And I was so struck by two things. First, that they didn't come in telling people what to think. They came in to share a story and then have people make sense of that. And that produced some cognitive dissonance, I think, that allowed people to shift perspectives. But most importantly, they understood the power of young people's voices, right? It was Anne Frank's voice who at 13, 14, 15 years old resonated around the world. It's an extraordinary story. But in some ways, that represents the power of young people's voices, which I think we fail to appreciate and harness. I love how Mark emphasizes, right? It's the teachers and it's the students staying focused on these folks and young people's voices. Young people all know the negative power of peer pressure, but many of them don't realize that that means they also have that potential to bring out the best in one another. And that informed Otto Frank. So the Anne Frank House, of course, is inspired by Anne's vision that we have yet to realize Anne's ideals, but it was also Otto's product in the sense of being an organization where he insisted first the Anne Frank House remain empty. And he did that because things were stolen, and I think it reflected his feeling of loss when everyone and everything was stolen from him. But he insisted the Anne Frank House not be just a mausoleum. It had to be a living educational institution. And that's part of what changed my life, because when I learned about the great work of the Anne Frank House around the world, working with peer education, helping young people talk about difficult histories with one another, I heard his voice. And you can find this wonderful 90-second clip on YouTube of Otto Frank saying, "Our duty and our aim is to bring young people together and help them understand one another. No one wants war. But as long as we don't know one another, there will be conflicts. And whether we're black or white or yellow, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, or Jewish, we have to live in one world. And we can learn that though we may be different, we can live together very nicely." So it's a beautiful sentiment, and it's one that we take up as our charge at the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina. So we are the official partner of the Anne Frank House for the United States and Canada. And what we're trying to do is to bring this approach to the country. So at this point, we have 18 traveling exhibits. We bring them into communities. And the purpose is really to bring young people together and spend 2 days with them so that they become the guides. And they have this incredible ability to put things in their own words. And as Amal showed us, right, we don't need technical jargon. We don't need fancy words to get at the heart of the matter. Often young people have that gift to be able to put their finger on it in a way that maybe adults or scholars, we get immersed in the details. There's a clarity that they can bring that's amazing. And it's the clarity that Anne somehow helped us find when she sat in this hiding place trying to make sense of a world where her government was trying to hunt her down and kill her. And that to me is, just an extraordinary circumstance for her to deal with, and the achievement of what she was able to produce in that setting, still committed to hope, and hope being not a naive optimism, but a recognition that we do share humanity. When we had Otto Frank and Martin Luther King dealing with the hatreds they dealt with, right? The idea that we might someday not have hatred against Black people, for Martin Luther King, who experienced Jim Crow, and for Otto Frank to imagine a world without anti-Semitism when he had experienced Auschwitz. It's almost too much of a dream to imagine it could be achieved. And yet, that's just the first step. That's the negative piece, if we paraphrase Martin Luther King, the absence of hatred. But our job is to go to that and beyond that, to the presence of understanding, right? If we have a world with an absence of hatred where people aren't hated for racial or other reasons, but they still have to be just like us, that's a world of racial tolerance without cultural difference. We need to get to cultural understanding, and that's the next horizon. That's where we're trying to get to. So I look forward to further discussion in the comments, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Stevic. It has been such a good experience working with such eminent experts in Holocaust education. I can testify to the amazing reception that one of the traveling exhibits and training of peer educators had in Iowa City. And I want to invite audience members to check out the Anne Frank Center website and the wonderful things it does. Our next speaker works with the power of young voices that Dr. Stevic emphasized. It is a pleasure to have on our panel another colleague from the University of Iowa. Mallory Hellman is the director of the Iowa Youth Writing Project. She holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and a BA in English from Harvard. She has taught creative writing at the University of Iowa, the Duke University Talent Identification Program, and at K-12 schools throughout the Midwest. Ms. Hellman, you have contributed a chapter to the book Exploring Anne Frank, titled Coexistences: The Holocaust and Jewish Joy, Israel, Palestine, and Teaching Jewish American Children Through an International Crisis. I understand you will tell us about your family's lived experience in the Holocaust and how it has changed you as an educator, both in synagogue, Sunday school, and in your secular creative writing pedagogy. I look forward to hearing more about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's presented so far this morning. To spare you all 12 minutes of looking at my face, I've prepared a presentation. Let me just bring it up here. The deck is loaded. Here we go. When I was in my final year of grad school, and my cohort and I were beginning to examine the dubious gift that was spending the rest of our lives with an MFA, we asked ourselves a question that was equal parts cheeky and profound. Are you going to be a writer who teaches or a teacher who writes? I was and am undeniably the latter. Teaching is in my bones. More on that later. But it wasn't until I was asked to write this chapter for Teaching Anne Frank in Difficult Stories that I realized that I have spent my whole career attempting to teach two things that are largely considered unteachable: creative writing and empathy. I came to creative writing in a fairly conventional way. I went to many, many years of word school. The empathy, though, is a story that began much longer ago. Specifically, in the early 1920s, in Łódź, Poland. Both of my grandparents were born there. Both of them were Orthodox Jewish. Both of them were very poor. And though they wouldn't meet for decades to come, they underwent similar experiences as their country was overtaken by the fascist Nazi regime and the Holocaust began. They were both moved into the Łódź ghetto as teenagers. My grandmother was a nurse apprentice at the maternity hospital there, and my grandfather, who was a little bit younger, just about bar mitzvah age, was simply trying to survive. They both wound up in concentration camps, my grandmother in Ravensbrück and my grandfather in Bergen-Belsen, alongside Anne Frank. In fact, the only reason he survived and Anne Frank didn't was that the typhoid that had become part of life in the barracks for the women didn't make it over to the men's barracks before liberation. After the war, my grandparents both survived. Thank God they were both liberated. And they took very different paths. My grandmother tried to go back to Łódź, tried to relocate her family, and couldn't because they'd all been exterminated. Through the help of friends and of Hayes, she made her way to the United States, where she was sent as a displaced person to, of all places, New Orleans, Louisiana. My grandfather went to Germany. He was fortunate to have spent the war alongside his younger brother, and he and his younger brother went to Germany, where they had a brief, thrilling career selling counterfeit watches to former Nazis. I'm still very proud of that. And after he had gathered enough resources and money to emigrate himself, he bought a bunch of china, silver, goods that would last, and he sent them to the United States ahead of him. He immigrated over. He was sent as a displaced person to Atlanta, along with his brother. But that trunk that he sent, well, that wound up in the great port of New Orleans. So when he went down to New Orleans to be reunited with his possessions, he was also told that there was a private duty nurse who was from the same town he was from, who had undergone everything he had undergone in the Holocaust, who was also Jewish, and who was pretty cute, who he should get to know. One thing led to another, and those people settled in New Orleans and became my grandparents, Max and Felicia Fuchsman. It's a beautiful love story, and it's one that my family cherishes. But I think at least as interesting as what my grandparents did before they came to the United States is how they chose to live their life afterwards. They spent their entire lives in New Orleans. My grandfather died in 1982 in a car accident, and my grandmother lived until 2012. Almost as soon as they got settled in the United States, they became activists. How easy it would have been to be forgetful individualists, to focus on material success, to focus on moving on, to focus on their lives, their families, but instead, they turned their understanding outward. This is a picture of my grandfather at the memorial that was built at Bergen-Belsen. He helped to get that created, and as it says there, it memorializes the 30,000 Jews that died there. That was just one of his first acts of activism. In the United States, in New Orleans, my grandparents joined the NAACP. They participated in protests. They did community organizing. They owned a furniture store that in a jaggedly desegregating New Orleans was one of few places that welcomed Black customers with open arms. And they did this because they believed firmly in the old adage that none of us are free until we all are. As I mentioned a moment ago, tragically, my grandfather died in a car accident in 1982. But before he did that, he spent his whole adulthood going to schools, colleges, and K through 12, and telling his story. And that's something that I did not realize until I was older, is a very powerful and poignant form of teaching. In fact, my grandparents were both teachers, seen that way. After my grandfather died, my grandma, who was always shyer, she wasn't as much of a the party starts when I walk in type of person, she took up his mantle of speaking publicly about her story, telling her story, talking about the camps, making sure people don't forget. Because even though it caused her discomfort, and I personally believe she really did not like talking about these things, she knew that the way to educate people about this topic was through personal narrative, that story does something that simple facts cannot. I was born in New Orleans too, just like my mom. I lived there until I was 7, and then my family and I moved to South Florida, partially because we wanted to be around more Jewish people. That was one of the notions that we had, that if I grew up in an environment where I was something close to a majority, that it might be a little safer and happier. As Naomi probably knows, one of our fellow panelists, the Jewish community in New Orleans is tiny, but it's vibrant. It's very together. And in South Florida, as you know, perhaps Oren can attest, and my parents who are on this call, it's so diffuse, right? The Jewish community is everywhere. It's part of everything that happens in that area because there are so many of us. I went to a high school where it was a K through 12 school where every single weekend in the 7th grade, there were competing bar mitzvahs, which is a different experience than most Jews have growing up in the United States. And I think it's true of us all that the parts of our identity that speak the most loudly to us are often the ones that resonate as different from other people around us, the ones that have the capacity to make us feel unsafe sometimes. Those are the identities that scream and pull and nag at us and beg to be examined. So when I grew up in a majority Jewish area, or at least what felt like one, I didn't really grapple with those questions of what it meant to be Jewish and what it meant to carry on the legacy of my grandparents and those like them, especially not through story. It wasn't until I got to college and started participating in some Jewish community organizing that I really started to see parallels between and among my writing life, my organizing life, and to my own shock, my Jewish life. When I was in college, I joined an organization called the Progressive Jewish Alliance. We made these amazing sweatshirts, among other things. And getting involved in Jewish activism gave me the chance to see religious education and religious involvement as something that wasn't flat, as a space where change could happen, where people could learn and evolve their opinions and share stories and take progressive action rather than learning a static text that, you know, has been passed down from generation to generation. And it was at that point, too, that I realized that both community organizing spaces and all of the educational spaces I had occupied have one vital characteristic in common. They run on stories. Think about it. Protests run on stories. Classes run on stories. Religious services, they run on stories because stories help us feel. As my career developed, I got an MFA. I started working with this organization called the Iowa Youth Writing Project. And just this week, I've been in 4th grade classrooms around Iowa City and the Eastern Iowa area, asking students this question: why do stories move us? Why is telling a story important in addition to learning facts? How can a story incorporate facts in a way that makes those facts more of a dynamic thing? And it should shock no one that even fourth graders know exactly why this is true, why a story sings in us with a frequency that nothing else can. It's because stories bring us, as Amal was saying earlier, into other people's hearts. Stories invite us into the soul and the experience of another person and allow them to, allow us to experience that narrative in a felt way instead of just an understood one. The goal of the Iowa Youth Writing Project is to do just that for every student we see. One of the saddest things I hear, and it's something I hear relatively frequently, is that students feel like they have nothing to say, that their own narratives aren't important or resonant, that they haven't been to enough places, that, heaven forbid, they haven't suffered enough to tell a story. And if we can ignite the notion in each student that their story has something unique to contribute, I think we've done our job as educators. And as Mark was saying, a lot of this really begins in that K through 12 space where we get students excited about narrative, where we get them inspired, where we share stories that can move them and inspire them to create in turn. When I started teaching Sunday school a few years ago, I felt like a complete fraud. To be perfectly honest with you all, I was learning the Hebrew that I was supposed to be teaching at the same pace as my students. I had grown up largely secular with an appreciation for my Jewish cultural heritage, but without the internalization of halakha and dogma and all of the things that I thought were supposed to go into running a Sunday school classroom. But the more I engaged with the students, the more I realized that so much of our work was similar to the work I was doing in the secular space with the Iowa Youth Writing Project. It was helping students understand their collective story as Jews, and specifically as Jews in Iowa. Two things we don't often think of as going together, right? We are definitely a minority in this environment. And working with students who might not have as much understanding of their Jewish cultural heritage, and the fact that said Jewish cultural heritage is not a monolith, has been a lot of the work I've done in the classroom. As I mentioned in my chapter, I was told to focus on Ashrenu, or Jewish joy. Excitement about our identity, excitement about our stories, excitement about coming together in a space that is specifically Jewish, and boy, was that fun to teach. It still is. It's my favorite part of Sunday school, in fact, coming together as this community. But after October 7th, it was impossible to continue along those lines of Ashrenu without introducing some complication. And the Hanukkah story really helped me out with that. For those of you who are familiar, it's about a small group of Jewish folks who had been oppressed by the Hasmoneans for decades, who fought back and toppled this Goliath that was against them, and were able to continue practicing, and of course, the miracle of the oil. But one of the things I found most interesting about this story, especially as applied to our current circumstances, is that it could be seen equally as a cry for Jewish self-determination, statehood, claim to a piece of land, and as a cry to overthrow a colonizing, imperialistic, occupying power. Stories can be interpreted in so many different lenses, and I encouraged my students to play with the complication of looking at both of those. And I realized that in so doing, I was thinking like Anne Frank. I was taking a complicated situation, and I was, as Amal says, writing about both the war and the tree. And the more we can do that, the more we can integrate our personal histories, the complications of our perspective, and our understanding into this element that is story, that can help us feel, the better we are as educators, as people, as citizens of the world. So thanks so much.
None of us are free until we all are. Story does something that simple facts do not. They help us feel. As what you just said, that is so true and so important to remember. And it's probably what brought me to studying stories. Our last speaker is Dr. Kumpf Bale, who is the Anne Frank Initiative Director and faculty at the University of Iowa's Department of German. It will have a new name next year. Her teaching and scholarship addresses youth agency, trees in the arts, and contested spaces. She has written a chapter for the book Homecoming Veterans in Literature and Culture. As a result of her enthusiasm for Anne Frank and teaching Anne Frank in her story, the 13th sapling of Anne Frank's chestnut tree was planted on the University of Iowa campus. She collaborated with a linguistics professor from the University of Ghent in Belgium for the book on a chapter titled Bridging Difficult Histories Globally and Locally. I believe she will tell us more about the Anne Frank initiative.
Thank you, Dr. Meyerhofer. I first wanted to express my thanks to all of you and my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speakers, our engaged audience, and the dedicated communications team from International Programs and all of our co-sponsors. I'd like to mention that we have gotten support from International Programs, the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina, the UI Center for Human Rights, the UI Jewish Studies Network, the UI Pentecrest Museums, the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature, UI Global Health Studies, UI College of Public Health, the Magid Center for Writing, the Obermann Center for Global Ties, and the Iowa City Public Library. I only have a few minutes, but I did want to share how this tree has been growing in Iowa City since it was planted in April of 2022. We came to be through the University of Iowa Provost Global Forum, which was awarded by International Programs. This allowed us to bring experts throughout the world to Iowa City to talk about how we teach Anne Frank. We had the 13th sapling was actually awarded in 2020. In 2022, we had the planting ceremony, and we also were able to have one of the exhibits that Dr. Stevick talked about, Let Me Be Myself, on display at the Old Capitol Museum here in Iowa City. This exhibit traveled the state of Iowa, and our planting ceremony had over 1,000 attendees. Getting this tree to Iowa was a very special opportunity for me. I worked together with the arborist, and we were able to bring the tree to Iowa City. We also had numerous individuals who supported our planting ceremony, speakers, and the entire community of Iowa City, as well as people from outside of our community, came to visit and watch us plant this special tree. The Anne Frank Initiative, or as we call it, the AFI, was born in January of 2023, and we have grown since that point. We view the sapling that is currently on our campus on the Pentecrest as a metaphor to grow awareness about the initiative's deeper mission. Currently, the AFI has a website, which I hope you'll visit, a strategic plan, we have bylaws, we have currently 13 board members, but we'll be growing starting in August. We have a student intern program. We have been awarded student research awards. We have a lockup logo. We have a book. We have a summer traveling course that will launch in 2026. When you go to our website, you will also be able to find out more about our mission, our vision, our inquiry, the way we access and build bridges between the UI campus, the larger Iowa City community, and the state of Iowa. We also talk about the plurality. We have members on our board that come from all different disciplines. We have staff members, and we are looking to have more community members be part of our initiative. Some of our accomplishments in the last year and a half have been 8th graders visiting our campus, between 250 and 300 8th graders coming, and we have organized breakout sessions for them that focus on issues like writing and identity, German Jewish heritage in Iowa City, We also have we celebrated Anne Frank's what would have been her 95th birthday in October with a multilingual reading of the diary, where 15 young readers brought her diary to life by reading text passages in their own native languages. We have supported International Day, the Human Rights Conference. We have organized a Resilient Voices project as part of the UNESCO City of Literature Book Festival, which was last October. We are starting to create and also have Little Free Libraries travel our community and spread books with human rights issues to young people. We also have every year, this will be the second annual time, our Roots Celebration, which focuses on the celebration of Jewish heritage during Jewish Heritage Month. Moving forward, some of our goals that we are hoping to have actually take place in the upcoming year are working with the University of Iowa Stead's Children's Hospital, having more students visit us from local and regional schools. We're working on an oral Jewish history project, and as I mentioned, a summer course launching in 2026. We have had really great experiences partnering with the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina. I've also had the opportunity to travel to Los Angeles and partner with the Anne Frank Center in LA. We hope to continue to grow our network so that we can do the type of work we'd like to do here in Iowa City and beyond our city and state borders. Lastly, if you would be interested in joining the Anne Frank Initiative, if you have ideas for programming, if you want to help, if you want to support us, please let us know. We are really eager to bring in people on board to help us carry out the work that we're doing. And lastly, just another great thank you to our co-sponsors for supporting our webinar today. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Russ Ganem, who will be speaking to us and sharing some words. He is the Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs.
Many thanks, Kirsten, and hello, everyone. As Kirsten said, my name is Russ Ganem, and I'm Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs here at the University of Iowa. And what a privilege it is to be here with you. What a privilege it is for IP to co-sponsor this event. And what an honor it is to hear these wonderful presentations from our panelists about discussing Anne Frank, learning from her experience, and then teaching that experience to present and future generations. So I'm feeling a warm sense of gratitude just to everyone for this most valuable and timely conversation. And so I had meant to present these remarks at the beginning of the webinar, but we had an emergency in our office, and so had to delay my comments until now. But again, let me extend an official warm welcome to everyone to today's webinar entitled Exploring Anne Frank in Difficult Life Stories. And so International Programs is proud to host this session as it continues to expand the programming created by the Anne Frank Initiative, otherwise known as the AFI, that Kirsten just described. So I wanted to let you know or give you some context about where the AFI fits within international programs and then some other activities that we sponsor. So International Programs hosts a number of affinity groups, or what we call affinity groups. And these are collections of faculty at the University of Iowa, and sometimes outside the university as well, with similar interdisciplinary interests. So in addition to the Anne Frank Initiative, other examples of affinity groups at the University of Iowa sponsored by International Programs include the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, the South Asian Studies Program, Jewish Studies, the African Studies Program, and the Iowa Global Health Network. And as Kirsten demonstrated in her terrific presentation, the Anne Frank Initiative is one of our most recent affinity groups, and also it is one of the most active. The AFI was born out of the Provost Global Forum that International Programs held in 2022 entitled Teaching Anne Frank. And the Provost Global Forum is International Programs' largest outreach event and takes the form of a 2-day conference on issues of global importance. So for Teaching Anne Frank, presenters discussed how Anne's life and legacy are taught in multiple disciplines in K-12 education and in museums and other media. And obviously that was those topics were covered in many of the presentations that we had the pleasure of listening to this morning. So speaking of museum exhibits, I did want to mention that coinciding with the Provost Global Forum in 2022 was a superb exhibit at our Penncrest Museum called Let Me Be Myself, The Life Story of Anne Frank. The exhibit showed the story of Anne Frank from her birth in 1929, and as we know, she was born on the exact same day as Martin Luther King, up to her death in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945. Each exhibition panel also contained images and texts regarding the world inhabited by Anne Frank, that is to say, the rise of Hitler, the persecution of Jews, and the Second World War. Both the Provost Global Forum and the museum exhibit underscored the importance of Holocaust education in a global context and the role Holocaust education can play in tackling difficult issues in the present and in the past. One of the most tangible results of the forum and the work done by the Anne Frank Initiative is the volume that we've all been discussing today, the volume published by Routledge this year, with the title that inspired today's conversation, that is to say, Exploring Anne Frank and Difficult Life Stories. I mean, this is quite an original volume. I think it's groundbreaking. My hope is that, I know it will be positively reviewed, but one of the reasons for today's webinar is obviously to promote the work of the AFI, the work of the volume, and to show that there is active research and scholarship devoted to teaching Anne Frank and making her story known to the world. So the hope with research, obviously, is that it becomes a teaching tool and that it begets other projects which will continue to move this momentum forward. So this particular volume was edited by Kirsten, along with Professors Waltraud Meyerhofer and Doyle Stivic, both of whom obviously are participating in today's webinar. And many of the panelists contributed to the volume, and we applaud their essays and welcome their presence. So in closing my remarks, please let me thank our panelists, which consist of an esteemed group of scholars from Iowa, the US, and the world over. Our gratitude also goes to IP's communications and relations staff, in particular Daniel Vorwerk, Amy Green, Katie Ron, Ben Partridge, Kate Murphy, and Hallie Russell. And finally, let me thank you, the audience, for your support of today's events. And so with that, I'll turn things back over to Kirsten and Waltraud for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghanim. We couldn't have done the work without the support by international programs. We got a number of questions and comments. One of them is about contextualizing the initiative with Jewish studies at Iowa. As I said, the Anne Frank Initiative grew out of the German department simply because of the interests of faculty members. A Jewish studies program at Iowa was formally established only a year ago with offering a certificate for undergraduate studies. That does not mean that there have not been Jewish studies at the University of Iowa. There have been a number of scholars, above all Lisa Heinemann in history, who have done very important work in, especially on the Holocaust and on Jewish history overall. There were scholars in other departments such as religious studies and anthropology who worked in the area. The University of Iowa already has many interdisciplinary groups. So it's definitely an important addition to have a formalized Jewish studies program. And of course, the Anne Frank Initiative will be eager to collaborate. We don't have much time. I was too optimistic about that earlier. Let's see, what else do we have?
I'm just looking through the comments, and we are low on time, but I did want to mention that we have people from all over the world coming in and sharing their messages. So, for example, we have somebody who is participating from Switzerland and mentioning that they had just visited the Anne Frank House. We also have other high school teachers who are asking questions about incorporating teaching the Holocaust and genocide into their regular US government classes. So this would be an opportunity where we are going to list the names and addresses of the speakers today. So some of you who may want to ask deeper questions can reach out to those individuals to find out more about their scholarship and also their teaching experiences in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. And also, please direct ideas for future events, topics for another webinar, maybe to both me or Dr. Kumpf-Bale. And we hope to continue on this trajectory, and it's so heartening to see all the interest. One general question to all the panelists. I'm not sure if you can also see the Q&A. The comment is, I'm interested in any opinions from panelists about the role of academics and academic institutions in promoting the kind of education and dialogue promoted in the book at a time when dialogue is important yet challenging. Would any of the panelists like to talk to this one?
Thank you, Oren.
Happy to volunteer. I think in these challenging times, we have to remember that we do still have universities. Professors are not, we're not all the enemy. And I think that there are obviously changes afoot and they are challenging to us, but the work continues and we need to try to keep a positive attitude. I'm the last person to be the poster child for positivity. I'm probably the most pessimistic of this group here. So I want to kind of, give a lot of, maybe hand this over to one of my colleagues who is much more able to speak to positivity. But look, we have to continue doing the work, right? Dialogue is what we do. Dialogue is part of teaching. And even though I strongly disagree with Mark's comment that our ideas are only powerful in the hands of teachers, I will agree that our ideas are powerful in the hands of teachers. And teaching involves listening and learning and thinking in collaboration with other people. So it's daunting. It's daunting, but we're going to keep doing the work anyway.
Thank you, Oren.
Yeah, exactly. The big issues today can only be addressed with truly interdisciplinary work and thinking outside the box, and sometimes finding ways around um, directions. Educating for a sustainable and empathetic world is a big task, and it succeeds only if all are part of it. Was there anybody else who wanted to respond to that question? Mark, maybe?
Mark?
Yes, I'd like to. Thank you. And I say this jokingly, I know Oren, and so I say this in good humor, but if you want to know how powerful the ideas of academics are, if teachers don't pick them up, just go look up how many times your dissertation has been referenced. You can usually count it on your hands. At any rate, I think that as we think about, we were talking about teachers, and I think that the jury's not out on this one. Holocaust education to me is, and I know that there's debate taking place, and I touched on that. To me, Holocaust education, the message of Anne Frank is on par with climate education. The jury's not out on that either. We are changing the climate, and it is going to affect us. And the shape of the earth, which, if there's any doubt amongst us, is spherical. Those aren't things that we don't know. We do know that, and so then the question is, what do we do with it? And I think that teachers are the answer, but I think that we as professors are uniquely situated because, as a few people have pointed out, I think Oren just mentioned it, universities aren't in the same scenario. It's not that things are all rosy and easy for us at a university, certainly not. Funding is tight, funding is threatened, and on and on. I know that, but I do not face the daily onslaught that I did as a high school teacher now that I'm a college professor, and that provides me with a platform and a position from which to help advocate for teachers to make sure that things like the messages that Anne Frank had for us find their ways into the hands of students, where I do believe they are the most powerful.
Yeah, I agree. Anne Frank's diary is definitely a book that gets read outside academia, outside of classrooms, and it touches so many lives. I believe Doyle wants to say something.
I'd love to share two quick thoughts. It's a beautiful question. And there's fear that professors and teachers can indoctrinate, but the counter evidence is if we could indoctrinate, then students would do their homework, right? So that doesn't happen. Education, in the words of Mike Rose, is an invitation. If we think of the carrot and the stick, the push and the pull, the push simply doesn't work. If it did, then we could preach from the soapbox and people would believe us. But it's an invitation, it's a question, it's an inquiry, and that's where the dialogue piece is. We can only understand one another by asking questions, and that's where dialogue is. That's where things can happen. That's part one. Part two is that our educational task is fundamentally different. I had a student fall for this white supremacist craziness, but you had to really seek that out in 1999. You had to get to the fringiest places to find it. When we got to Dylan Roof, 10 years ago, he stumbled on a website and went down the rabbit hole and fell for it. And all that hate that was promoted systematically by the Nazis was just a click away. It's still a click away, but that's not enough to capture the situation we're in now. Now it's getting shoveled at us by algorithms. And students are spending 4 or 5 hours on their phones every single day having stuff shoveled at us by algorithms. So it's not a click away. It's not fringe stuff we have to chase to find. We have to create an educational response to the fact that our kids are getting deluged with this stuff. So when I was in school, they would just present us with a mountain of truth that we had to consume. That's not our situation anymore, and it can't compete with the mountain of nonsense coming at them. we have to shift the entire education system from providing truth for them to consume to helping them know, is it true and how do we know? And I refer to that as building a culture of evidence. But if we can have them grappling with that question, is it true and how do we know? What's the evidence? Then we're in position to produce the kind of changes to handle the transformation of the world students are grappling with. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Doyle. Yeah. We wanted to ask if there's anybody else from the panelists that had anything else to add. We promised you that you would have that time. So is there anyone else who has something to say? All right, then.
You can, of course, always contact us with the many ways we have today. In the name of the audience and the panelists, I want to thank everybody who spoke and contributed. And it continues to amaze me how Anne Frank connects so many different areas and experts and speaks to, as we have heard, successfully speaks to young people and old people alike, people from all walks of life. So thank you all, and let's continue this.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.